Welcome to another episode of Story Tiles. It's that time of the year again, when everyone puts out their top 10, and this is no exception. The top 10 of 2023 adventure board games starts now. This year was an excellent year for board games, and so we are going to start off with some honorable mentions. Long ago, a pact was made with the dwellers of the wood. By the rules of this agreement, men must keep strictly to their pathways and villages, scattered throughout the vast forest like embers of light in the darkness. What lies beyond belongs to other, older masters, creatures of ancient magic, who look unfavorably upon trespassers. Despite this pact, daring souls explore the woodland labyrinth in search of treasure, adventure, and hidden secrets. Welcome to the Witchwood. Destiny's Witchwood is an expansion to Mika Golubyovsky and Filin Milunski's Destinies, which came out in 2021 and introduced an app-assisted adventuring story where you would lay out these tile cards and slowly reveal the world before your miniatures to explore. Microatures, really, because they were really tiny miniatures. You would use these to move across and interact with each other and the world itself in search of quest elements that would help your character to improve by doing skill checks to overcome things, but ultimately competing with other players to see who would be first to reach their choice of goal or destiny. Now, you could play it solo or cooperatively in the sense that it is less competitive, but I believe that Destiny's Witchwood is now much more friendlier towards solo play anyway, in that it's not so much about the points or that it's harshly exclusive. Now, even though it's labeled as the first competitive story-driven RPG-like board game ever, it is still just an interesting narrative adventure to discover by yourself. The characters are nicely portrayed, variable in nature, and more or less themed after Slavic folklore, even when their names are generic descriptors. The mystic, the matriarch, the hag, the drowner. More prominent characters like Baba Yaga and the Firebird are present in gorgeous miniatures no less. Many of the characters' destinies are exactly the same, however, like the crone and the hag, or the Vesta and the maiden, which feeds into the complaint that Destinies is not a very replayable game in terms of variety. Now, the locations are all set in this dark Eastern European woodland. You know, that's very dark and very atmospheric. And it's a new setting, whereas the previous Destinies was medieval and you had to deal with demons and the sorts. This deals more with Slavic folklore, which is just lovely. I've been really into Slavic folklore these last 2 years, what with visiting the worlds of Zarifia and the forests of Radgost. And this is just a relatively fresh and specific kind of subgenre or theme to wander around in, being all dark and mysterious in an enchanting but also weirdly satisfying claustrophobic way. Now, Destinies and its previous 2 expansions, Sea of Sand and Myth and Folklore, had 11 self-contained campaigns, and Witchwood adds another 4. They mostly revolve around Baba Yaga and the Firebird, and they follow the same format as the previous ones. Intros are narrated, while all other narrative text is read-only. There is some background ambiance to add atmosphere. Events that occur are of course bound to your character and activate skill checks that you do in order to progress. Now, the reason why it's on honorable mention again is because, first of all, it's an expansion, and so it naturally doesn't add very much to the Destiny system, other than just more content, of course. It's fairly standard stuff, but it's more of a good thing in my opinion. It also scores lower on my list of honorable mentions because it's just 4 more stories to enjoy, but to a system that's compact and tight in design. San Francisco, 1937. Your cargo plane flies through a portal in the sky, transporting you to a rugged landscape filled with bizarre creatures, scheming gods, and untold dangers. But can you find your way back before the portal closes? Sleeping Gods Distant Skies is the sequel to the 2021 game Sleeping Gods, and it is an honorable mention here because not only is it the sequel, but it also feels somehow a little bit less than its predecessor. So no full honors just yet. Now, there are 5 characters as opposed to the 9 in the original game. which means a little bit less management, and that's nice. However, it also means that there's less variety. The characters are generally of the similar composition and skills, and their ability to hold items that buff them in some way or another. Much like the original as well, there's no real depth to the characters. There's a little bit of backstory to each, but no real character growth, and so it's mainly their visuals and the situations they land in, from which you have to let your imagination form their emergent stories. You are traveling around in a plane as opposed to a boat, which I found was more interesting somehow anyway, but you're also in a smaller part of the same world. That just seems limiting to the feeling of an open world system where you could be exploring anything in any direction, theoretically. This sequel is set more to the north of the Wandering Sea, and it is land-based. So you're flying from a large part to another part by plane, which adds this little plane mechanic to the game. But that too, in my opinion, is less interesting than managing the boat, even though the boat may have been a little bit too much to manage, and that's probably also the reason why they scaled it down on gameplay. You're also still exploring parts of the map book on any given page, so that it's kind of the same as Sleeping Gods, but I just somehow feel that walking around on the landscape, then making it back to where your plane is so you can fly to a different part of the land, is somehow less interesting. Now, the overall story is no longer about waking up the gods. Now you're trying to lower the threat of this entity that is keeping you from flying your plane through the portal and back to San Francisco. It's as simple as how you got there. The game literally begins with that intro I started off with earlier, and that's it. Then you get a comic book that shows just that and a tutorial. This tutorial teaches you the essential gameplay, which is great, and it gives you enough of a feel of the game. Then the encounters during play are somewhat tied to the overall plot, but often also self-contained. There's a lot of interaction between characters. The encounters that they have and the landscape they traverse, mostly through skill checks that you have to do to pass, and of course the regretfully mandatory combat that a lot of games seem to fall back upon to deliver the meat of the game. Although combat in the sequel is a little bit more streamlined than the original, it still takes up a fair amount of time. I would have liked to have seen investigation, dialogue, and discovery be equally extensive as combat is, but that still seems to be a challenge for too many game designers. It's still a nice addition to the Sleeping God series, arguably Ryan Laukatt's crowning achievement among all of Red Raven's games so far, again, in my opinion. Much like Destiny's Witchwood, Distant Skies adds to what came before while adding less than what the original package offered, which is why it's an honorable mention here.
Merry meet, fellow witches. I'm glad so many of you have answered my call. Hear my words. The spirits visited me in my dreams. My time is passing, and soon I must bestow upon one of you my title of Septima, leader of all witches of the world. In a year's time, on the Witches' Sabbath, the wisest of you will inherit all my knowledge. Now go, as your task is great and time is short. You may seek advice from my trusted crow. She's the smartest bird I've met. Although...
Grrr! You bet I'm the smartest. Come on, you little rascals. Granny wants a nap. So let me show you around Noctenburg. Teach you what's what.
I wish you would show some manners, at least once.
The third honorable mention is Septima. This is a competitive, highly interactive strategy game. So, yeah, basically a Euro game. And I don't like Euro games as much as I like adventure games. Mainly because they focus more on gameplay and strategy, and often the collection of victory points, than they do on narrative, story, and thematic immersion. Having said that, Septima is admittedly very thematic, and that's also the reason why I wanted to mention it, because I like the theme of witches healing people and helping communities rather than, being betrayed as evildoers with magical skills that need to be burned at the stake. That twisting of their true historical identity is something I never really cared for, so this wholesome representation of witches is why I actually really enjoy it. It is way more difficult to identify the story elements of character, event, and location in Euro games, and this is no exception. Nonetheless, you don't play a single character. Like many Euro games, there is no you represented by an avatar, and in this case, you're playing a coven of witches. And so you gather up 4 witches on your player board, and you go around the woods of Noctenburg, represented by the main board, with your coven as a whole, gathering ingredients, making potions, and healing citizens of the village nearby. All the while, you're trying to avoid witch hunters who are out to capture your witches and put them on trial. Now, there's a booklet that Mindclash Games released online called The Legendarium of Witches that holds the background of every witch and that adds a lot, if not most of the story. Sadly, it is not an active part of the game, nor is it actually included as a physical booklet in the game. Now, designer Robin Hegedus, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, and artists Barbara Burnett and Vilo Farkas, all Hungarians, I believe, did a really excellent job at infusing the character of witches and witchcraft throughout both visuals and game mechanisms, give you some semblance of what it was like to be a witch, or so we presume. There's no real narrative, no real story to speak of. The main objective of the game, because it is a Euro game, revolves around gathering points, and in this case they're called wisdom points. You do so by gathering ingredients, making potions, healing villagers, and occasionally casting spells. The expansion Shapeshifting and Omens adds shapeshifting qualities to it, where you can change into a familiar like a cat or a frog, and there are omen cards. There's a lot here, but in the end, the game plays pretty much as any Euro game plays. It's not a campaign, and it's not story-driven. The location of Noctenburg is beautifully illustrated. In fact, everything is so very pretty, given form by the artwork and by excellent graphic design, not to mention impressive production values. Mindclash Games does this so very well. And if you got the deluxe edition, then you got metal coins to represent the wisdom points, screen-printed wooden pieces that represent the ingredients, and a gorgeous potion tray and handy component trays. All in all, a very neat little production. And it helps to immerse yourself at the table when you're combining the tactile experience of gathering these ingredients and flipping the illustrated action cards like so many tarot oracle cards. Septima is a type of Eurogame I can see myself making a more cinematic story for. It has enough elements to be a thematic adventure game from which emergent storytelling could spring forth, just like I did with Tapestry and what I'm currently now doing for Vindication. Both of these Euro games I have added a more thematic approach to, so you can enjoy the game's setting and components, and play it rather as a straight-up storytelling experience. Talking about modifying games and Vindication, there is another game on my honorable mention list, and that is... Vindication started out as a straight-up Euro game that revolved around gathering victory points called Honor, any which way that you could, using a cube economy based on 6 human traits. If that sounds sterile and abstract, then you would be right. However, its world came alive through the evocative artwork of Brett Carville, Emiliano Cordoba, Bartek Fedichak, Noemi Concoli, and Piu Tiu. Together with Mark Nielinger designing the gameplay as well as its distinctive graphic design, that, by the way, lives on through follow-up games Unsettled and Spiritfire, Vindication ended up giving off confusing vibes regarding whether it was a thematic or mechanical game experience. Ultimately, opinions settled on the side of 70% mechanisms and strategic gameplay and 30% thematic storytelling. This was not helped by later expansions, Leaders and Alliances, which only added more ways of scoring points but never really addressed the lack of thematic exploration of the world. So, in the summer of 2020, fellow designer Patrick Kerwin and myself set out to create an RPG set in the world of Vindication. Before long, we were contacted by Mark and Tom from Orange Nebula, stating that they were making something similar and if we wanted to join forces. Long story short, we ended up working on Vindication Chronicles in a joint attempt to restore the balance in favor of theme by adding personal story cards and how you gain companions and relics and traits while resolving global events on the island that all players would be subjected to, all the while gathering renown and titles and becoming vindicated in a more storytelling fashion. Now, there are no extra characters in Chronicles, and likewise no locations were added either, although a further expansion, Villages and Hamlets, was released alongside Chronicles to give even more variety to the locations one could visit on the main game board. But the events is where Chronicles really shines, with dozens upon dozens of cards that held nothing else than a little story prompt, a dualistic choice, and a resulting effect that could be placed underneath the cards that you would gain normally throughout the game. Players could create a tableau or path of narrative events in front of them, and this path tells the journey of how the player became vindicated while meeting these NPCs and fighting monsters or just generally finding loot. Furthermore, dozens of event cards are available to everyone to be resolved, adding world events to the game. But Chronicles is not perfect. Adding more story means adding gameplay length. There were added elements like the Firewind Festival that many people felt just added yet another way to earn honor points. And of course, hardcore strategic Eurogame fans of Vindication found less value in reading narrative, while others who originally felt disenchanted with the lack of theme in Vindication were hard to win back based on this one expansion. Now, I prescribed myself to the latter group, of course, and so I put Vindication Chronicles on the honorable mention list, not just because it's an expansion of a game that I designed myself, which would be weird, but more so because it isn't indicative of how inspirational Vindication really is. Not only did it rally a community around Orange Nebula, but Chronicles is only the first step in a new imaginative way of playing it. The Vindication Redemption project that I've started recently aims to make a complete reversal of the ratio of gameplay and cinematic immersion in the game, in a way that leans mostly towards storytelling and away from the point gathering game as it is now. And that has brought me a lot of joy just in designing it alone. That's why, as an inspiration, Vindication Chronicles is on my list for Honorable Mention 2023.
The god of war speaks. With a senses-numbing roar, howitzer rocks back on its carriage, flinging a 40-kilo shell skyward. The round soars up through clouds of graphite gray smoke, along with hundreds of its brethren. It reaches apogee above the filthy monochrome blanket of wreckage and snow shrouding the corpse city. Welcome to the zombie-ravaged ruins of war-torn Stalingrad. Escape from Stalingrad Z, in my case, should be called Escape from Hellboy Z, mainly because this is the game that I hobbied the heck out of to make it into an extension of my Hellboy board game experience. I'm not a huge fan of war-themed games, or zombie games for that matter, but when I saw what this game was, which is a dice-rolling narrative choice scenario campaign game on a tactical map book that you play out page by page, I decided that I could fairly easily reskin this game with a theme that is really close to my heart, Hellboy. Owning the Hellboy board game and having redesigned many components for that game as well made it easier for me to adapt Escape from Stalingrad Z to Escape from Hellboy Z. I swapped out zombies with the ancient undead from the Darkness Calls storyline and expansion, as well as making the Russian and German protagonists agents from the BPRD. Using the painted miniatures, as well as printing out the Hellboy artwork on tokens and putting them inside plastic coin capsules, allowed me to play this tactical miniature campaign to its fullest extent. The characters are little sheets with typical wargame stats, only now with Hellboy and BPRD imagery plastered all over it. This allows me to immerse myself in little scenarios where the BPRD agents are beset upon by enemies that actually appeared in the Hellboy comics. Stalingrad Z comes in 3 different versions, depending on your budget, and on the amount of space that you want to take in your board game collection. So there's tokens, standees, and miniatures, and getting the tokens only version makes it fairly easy to adapt it to any thematic preference or indeed table presence. In my case, the simple set of booklets with some homebrewed coin capsules and a bag full of Hellboy minis makes for an awesome experience. The locations of Stalingrad Z come from a map book that is scenario bound, which means a great amount of specificity of locations linked directly to each scenario that you are playing. The bond between locations and story or events is very strong because of this. And just like Jaws of the Lion or Tidal Blades 2, or any other dungeon crawler adventure game that has a map book,
This is a great improvement over having tiles that have generic backgrounds on them. They just don't speak to the imagination like a map book can. Now, the illustrations of the maps are very functional, but not extremely memorable. They serve their purpose. The game has over 45 scenarios, with a nice spread of branching choices. The total campaign playing time depends on how hard you want to go through the story without relying on continuously gathering new resources like ammunition and first aid kits, because you will run out of them. Surviving in this game means sometimes making the choice to gather resources instead of progressing the story. Of course, playing through Hellboy, you could ignore everything and just play every single story scenario to the end and get through this entirety of the book within a reasonable amount of time. This game, in the end, is on my honorable mention list because of its simplicity in terms of gameplay. It is a very tactical war game still, so the rules can get a little crunchy. And the best part is the hobby factor. It allows you to reskin the game to your favorite theme, and if the game's acclaim and Raybox's intentions are anything to go by, that's exactly what they aimed for themselves. See the new iteration of this game called Gates of Niflheim. And those are my honorable mentions for the year. Now let's get on to the top 10, starting with number 10. Dark clouds over Japan. Ascend arose in strength. Hordes of AIs patrolling streets of post-apocalyptic Japan. As a human being, you may try to stop at once for all, fighting dangerous enemies, forming alliances with chosen factions, transplanting your consciousness into other bodies and modifying your bodies, hacking your way to victory. Tamashii is a cyberpunk adventure board game, and it says it has a post-apocalyptic vibe. I just found it very purpley. But I've always wanted to have a cyberpunk adventure game, and so when Awakened Realms Light announced that they were going to do one, I thought, maybe this is it. I've always liked Awakened Realms, and I adore Tainted Grail and Aetherfields and ISS Vanguard, so maybe this would follow their footsteps in building a world worth exploring. I even proposed the name Tamashii over Gaijin, which got accepted, and so there's that. But when Gamefound Campaign ran its course, I was not swayed by the pattern-building puzzle at the heart of the game. I liked the cooperative part of it, but jumping from hex tile to hex tile while trying to puzzle your way to victory was not something that I found sounded like an adventure. It just felt like solving patterns, and so I did not back it. And then, when it arrived to backers, a friend of mine came by and we played it. We even did an unboxing of it here on Story Tiles, and there was actually a surprising amount to like. First of all, the characters, there are some very interesting ones here, I feel. They're not really well represented in the core game, however. The core box has standees while an expansion holds miniatures, which I generally think is a good idea from Awakened Realms in the past, because their miniatures have not always had a proper function or a lasting presence during gameplay, typically serving as placeholders. But this would be towards the enemies and not the player characters. Those would still be miniatures. An even nicer thematic twist would be to have the digital personas in the game be 2D acrylic standees, and the physical bodies they jump into be miniatures. So the characters are not well represented, unless you get the whole enchilada. But the personas are interesting, as well as the fact that you can slip from one body into another. That is definitely a plus. Location-wise, I still struggle with the fact that the areas don't flow into one another. I would have preferred a more dungeon crawl style network of streets and buildings, but instead we get this very abstract set of placeholder locations that you jump across. But I get it though. The gameplay necessitates it. Yes, the table presence is not as great as some other games from Awakened Realms, but it does keep the footprint down a lot. And more importantly, it serves the purpose of never knowing what you're going to encounter. What with being in the digital realms, where it makes no difference that places are disconnected from each other and only reachable through cyberspace. So yeah, I did not find that too obstructive in the end, but it's definitely not a pro. And then finally the story and the world building. That's what actually surprised me the most. It had a surprising amount of story to it that is well integrated into the gameplay. It's extremely kinetic in a way. It scores high points with me because the narrative is just really well done. There are a surprising amount of scenarios in the box and a lot of interaction while you're playing. You're continuously reading, not too much, just enough to get you going, at which point it ties into the gameplay that follows. That gameplay is accompanied by an intermediate goal that, when accomplished, leads back to a bit of story, and so on and so on. The production value of the components, regretfully, is fairly poor. Cubes just don't fit into player boards, flimsy cards, and very flimsy scenario sheets. The worst offender may be the token bags, and because this is a token pulling game or a bag builder, the bags are just too flimsy, and with the tokens being cardboard, that combination is just unsatisfactory. Mind you, this is if you didn't get the upgraded components like plastic tokens. I feel like the chits are always kind of hiding in little nooks and crannies inside the bag, and it's very tactile and satisfactory experience in that regard. And it's a big deal when you're digging into these bags all the time during the game. But on the plus side, the art is immersive. It's again very pink and purpley, but it ties into the zippy, kinetic, cyberpunk theme and surprisingly pleasant world to dive into every now and then. That's why it's my number 10 of the year. The reason why it's still so low in my top 10 is because it is ultimately still a puzzle game, and it is also something that I don't know if I would ever like having the core box for. If you got all the expansions for a behemoth like this, it would cost you a fair amount of money, and that's just not acceptable these days anymore for my collection. So there you have it. On to number 9. Welcome, weary traveler, to the town of Gallows Springs, the only civilized town on the entire Death Helm frontier. Surrounded by bandits, predators, and cultists, only the toughest survive. If you are going to last, you must find a source of income, purchase new gear, build shelter, recruit a posse, and protect your homestead. Do you have what it takes? Bantam West by designer Ike Bruni-Carty and art by Paul Amaya and Anli Art is an American Wild West open-world sandbox exploration game where you take on the persona of one of 4 characters who compete to gain the most notoriety. And if that premise makes you think this is a Euro game where you set out to just gain victory points, think again. This is still a very open sandbox style game where you can do whatever you want, and that includes a variety of things like harvesting raw materials to sell so you can buy gear, chasing down bandits, hunting animals for trophies, and do more elaborate Wild West style things, depending on the scenario. Your choices, and of course, how the winds shift mid-game. Like Tamashi, I did not originally have a pledge, but I took one over from someone else, and also like Tamashi, I did an unboxing video that you can check out here on this channel. Now, you can choose from 2 male and 2 female characters with asymmetric stats, and sometimes a little bit of gear to start off with. Each has a different style of playing, so you could play a thief that goes out very stealthily, breaks into things, or an arsonist who just sets fire to cabins, or just a good old-fashioned gunslinger or merchant. For a sandbox game, this game does not have a lot of characters or NPCs that you meet. There are bandits and cultists and wild animals who are generally utilitarian in that you need to get them to get gold or kill in order to gain those notoriety points. But the locations are equally minimal, to be honest. 4 different cardboard squares represent 4 types of wilderness that don't connect to each other in an organic way. That is not meant to be fair, they're just meant to add some variety or locales where you can harvest materials and do a variety of other things, and you traverse these landscapes on circled areas that indicate how visible you are to others, and you can follow routes that require skill checks, say if you're climbing up a mountain or crossing a river. There's a 5th location that is the town of Gallows Springs. Here you do a majority of selling and trading of items or buying gear like a horse, weapons, or even just hanging out and having a drink or heal up. There are some actions that require skill tests, and each location mentioned so far has a day and night side, which makes for slightly more variety. The event cards are where most of the world interaction happens. You have a nice deck that you can draw from whenever you move from one location to another. Typically, this involves drawing a card, reading the fluff text, and making a choice or doing a skill check, after which something fairly mundane happens. This is a classic Western themed game after all, not some Lovecraftian or post-apocalyptic one. There are a few scenarios or play modes to this game, but because the nature of the game is still a standalone sandbox session where the goal is to gain notoriety points, there's no campaign or overall story to follow. And for me, that kind of detracts a bit from the whole experience. You could just ignore the notoriety points or see them as a timer of when to quit Bantam West, but the game is still meant to be played as a competitive game. Mind you, it does have a solo mode, and you could play out the scenarios by yourself or cooperatively as an immersive hour of just doing stuff while coming up with your own emergent stories. The real reason why it's on my top 10 in the first place is that it is a very interesting, compact little package of Western immersion. And having said all that, I do however see that the replayability will drop over time unless we start seeing expansion content in the future. I am not going to play the exact same game, any game, when I have the option to crack open new content in an existing game. That's why I do prefer campaign games over a single session rinse and repeat games. And that's why it's my number 9 on the list. And maybe at some point, I could combine elements of The Few and Cursed, Shadows of Brimstone, and Grimslingers to make some kind of ultimate Weird West adventuring game experience, but that's for a special episode of The Hobby down the road. Speaking of campaign games, let's continue up the list with number 8.
Long ago, a splendid streak of crimson fell from the sky and carved a valley from the earth. The foliage that the light touched grew wild and fierce, and the wildlife grew larger and more fearsome. In the centuries that followed, a red substance that people who named material could be found throughout the valley. Artisans learned to craft the substance which lent magical qualities to their works, which they call artifice. From their works, an age of industrial revolution swept through the township, but so did the danger that came along with it. Artisans of Splendid Vale by Nikki Valens is a bubbly, charming little adventure in every possible sense of the word. It's a very cooperative RPG-like game with personal storybooks, dice, character sheets, and a map book for your meeples. You fight battles, you have an overall storyline, it has legacy elements in that you're always revealing new parts of the story and unlocking skill and gear cards to buff your character with. All these aspects immediately drew me in the first time I saw this, especially the fun little bits, like the paper character sheets with asymmetric tech trees that represent their specific skill sets. This game exudes fun. So let's talk about the characters. Like many games of this ilk, there are strictly 4 characters you kinda have to play. You can play less if you want to though, but it ain't easy. I played the game solo, which is interesting to say the least. The story taps into all 4 characters at all times, so you would have to ignore what some characters do in some parts of the story, and because I do like to explore everything, I would play all 4 characters at once anyway. That means you have to flip through 4 chunky booklets that don't stay open easily to read the specific insights that the character brings to the general story. Because this ultimately is a game where you are encouraged to do voices and fully roleplay your character, preferably with 3 other friends, it is less satisfying if you're alone. Now, the game comes with a map book with several locations in it that are slightly modified depending on the choices you made previously. These are tactical maps that you play out encounters on. There are also point of interest mini-maps inside the booklets that again allow specific characters to address things that only they can see. Each of the 4 booklets will have the same map that everyone shares, but with an extra paragraph number that only one character can flip to and interact with. So if you are a completionist like me, you'll really want to see everything right from the start. Solo play is definitely not ideal for this game, and is actually not even recommended again. So the best number is definitely 4. So we talked about characters and locations. The characters, by the way, were represented by the cutest screen printed meeples you'll ever find, and the location maps, which are just adorable and blend right in, is thanks to the visual style of the game, which is very cohesive and colorful. So kudos to the artists MK Castaneda, Little Chan, Cleonique, Hilsaka, Lisa Pierce, Christina,
arbitrary for doing this. The theme is very inclusive towards diversity, and you'll see this in the art as well. It's very wholesome in a way that is not just a fantasy battle game or trope fantasy at all, but you're mainly doing other things like exploring locales, reading dialogue to each other, pursuing skills, and furthering your character arc. So it's all very personal. The story is mostly within the booklets, but there are strong incentives to roleplay. The balance, therefore, between pre-written narrative and emergent narrative is quite sublime and almost unique in this genre. You can see where Nikki took her previous work on Legacy of Dragonholt and doubled down on every cool aspect while filling in parts missing from her previous narrative foray. This game is just pure fun. It's pretty to behold, it's cute to handle, and the components, insert, and finishes are well thought out and well matched with each other. The experience is one of friendly danger. I hesitate to say family friendly because it does deal with relationships, including some sexual relations, or references thereto, which to me completes the conversations about feelings and mental struggles of the characters, rather than being gratuitous or exploitative in any kind of way. This is a refreshing entry into this genre of adventure games, and that's why it's on my number 8. It's not higher because simply the limitations of gameplay, the user experience of handling the booklets, and more or less forcing 4 players to play this game feels limiting, despite also being a strong design choice in itself.
You are in a far future Earth, saved from the great calamities through the hard work of humankind. The geography of the Earth and biology of its creatures has changed drastically. This new world is covered in wildly diverse flora and fauna, much of it untouched by human hands for more than 1,000 years. Only time will tell. Stories will be uncovered by its inhabitants. One of only 2 games that I share with other content creators' top games of the year is probably Earthborn Rangers. This deck builder exploration game straddles the fine line between being thematically very innovative and fresh, while also being mechanically sound and crunchy. It resembles a lot of the DNA of Arkham Horror LCG from Fantasy Flight Games, mainly because it shares the same designers and artists. Andrew Fisher and Andrew Navarro have created this inviting world away from Lovecraft and planted it deep into the realm of solarpunk. This is an environmentally sound utopia, set in the far future when humanity has almost gone extinct and Mother Earth has restored its balance. This is thematically interesting and novel, while also promoting a game experience around the setting that does not focus on strife, combat, and gloom, but on creativity, social interactions, and exploration. With the artwork of Joe Banner and Evan Simonet, they have created inspiring visuals within a functional graphic design that may deter hardcore thematic adventure players, bolstered by the fact that this is a card game and thus inherently has a limited table presence, but still manages to look inviting and coherent. Furthermore, the environmental considerations of its production have made a game that is unassuming and utilitarian, but could also be perceived as too functional, or expensive for what you get, quote unquote. The critics who did not find this hidden gem are missing out. And why is it a hidden gem? Well, let's see. You play a ranger, one of 4 archetypes, with one of 4 backstories that goes exploring in the valley represented by a large map, and up to a dozen of location decks that explain the particular setting within the valley where you're at any given moment. These rangers have 4 aspects, which vary in strength, attributes, and gear that define who you are as a person. This is really cool because you instantly start identifying with your deck of cards and might not play in the best way strategically speaking, but rather in a way that feels like you're doing what a ranger would do. Your ranger also grows over time, adding skills, gear, and companions in order to overcome increasingly challenging situations. The places you visit are represented by small decks of cards that are mixed in with the type of terrain you have traveled through to get there. This leads to a good amount of random replayability, but perhaps over time, a limited specificity of encounters because you will have already seen some cards that represent the creatures, natural features, and obstacles that you face.
Depending on the range of where you are in relationship to any given card, which can be nearby or further away, this range thematically symbolizes the distance over which your ranger is seeing and tracking things, and mechanically influences how these encounters may or may not affect you. Now, the strongest aspect of the game, however, is the living world mechanism. This is truly innovative. The synergy between locations and characters and events is very, very well done in Earthborn Rangers, primarily due to the reactivity that takes place after each turn. There's a randomizing modifier to your actions, given form by these challenge cards, and they also dictate which cards may trigger and interact with each other and with you at any given moment, making the world truly feel alive and fully functional with or without the Ranger's direct input. The meta experience of listening to the Earthborn Rangers podcast and seeing how the game developed over time just adds to how chill, nice, and welcoming this game feels. The environmentally sound production is trailblazing the way for many more games to hopefully follow, and the apparent love for role-playing games that the two Andrews exhibit through various props and a full-on lore book, not to mention snippets on their website and plans to expand their world even further in the future, shows how committed they are to lovingly craft a wholesome game experience. These efforts have made playing the game way more enjoyable than it would have been if it had been a standalone PvP combat card experience with limited narrative, like a lot of these card games exhibit these days. And this makes Earthborn Rangers stand out as a shining example of what can be done both thematically and mechanically, and rightfully so deserves a spot on this top 10. If there is any limitation or fault to be found, and why it's not higher than the 7th spot, it would be my own preference towards adventure board games that simply contain more than just cards, a few tokens, and some props. I do adore a good table presence. It's part of the fun.
Montreal, city of 100 steeples. Long as Montreal reigned as a major commercial hub for mortals. In the shadows away from prying eyes, the city has known as the stronghold the vile Sabbath vampires who indulge in their monstrous nature as they terrorize the living in the undead. That is, until the Night of Ashes, when vampire hunters stormed Montreal and destroyed almost every vampire they could find in the city. Now, years later, two sects have surfaced in Montreal, and the fate of the city is in your hands.
Vampire the Masquerade Chapters is a mature, story-driven RPG-inspired experience in 40 chapters by designers Thomas Filippi and Gary Petre, visualized by Christophe Bienlavsky, Dominique Mayer, and several others. The novelty of having 40 highly specific scenarios, each with their own location, their own NPCs, their own storybook, progressing an overall story that promised dark, nefarious plotting and bloody escalation, was just too good to pass up when it launched several years ago. Especially with a presentation that was visually stunning and succinct in driving home the Vampire the Masquerade IP about vampire clans engaging in intrigue and subterfuge while plotting against each other. Not even a fan of the IP itself, but just in cool modern vampires, I was further pulled in by what I would consider pure catnip, the concept of an RPG in a box. This concept has been explored in the past by various games to lesser or greater success. Most notably are Folklore the Affliction, a variety of dungeon crawlers like Descent and Madara, narrative adventure games like Solomon Kane and Tainted Grail, and overland adventure games like The Icefaring Guard and Explore It. It is a hard concept to nail what makes a role-playing game tick and capture that essence into cardboard and paper form. But chapters appear to be doing just that with proper character sheets that were reminiscent of similar character sheets in RPGs, dice and miniatures, obviously, but especially the self-contained scenarios, each with their own tactical map where not only you could engage in physical combat, but also dialogue and negotiation with NPCs with some investigation of the locale itself to boot. Your vampire belongs to one of 8 vampire clans. You have 3 attributes: physical, social, and mental, a choice out of 16 different skills and 3 disciplines. So there is enough variety in how characters not only start, but also develop over time. With the dialogue of the story centered around the vampires that you play, there is enough to chew on, both from the idea of a living world as well as towards your own personal development as a vampire. But as opposed to, say, Artisans of Splendid Vale, you don't necessarily grow as a character during the campaign, so you never really feel any connection to them. The tiles are almost too dark and have very little in terms of elements to interact with. It still makes me long for the days of Mansions of Madness, which not only had elaborate artwork on its tiles, but also made them relevant to the story. The artwork itself, though, is very atmospheric and fits within the overall style of the vampire world. Moving through the locations is where the game starts showing its weakness, however. Movement, facing, and other tactical considerations barely matter, if at all. And then only when physical combat ensues, investigation and dialogue don't significantly take that into account where you stand, and the points of interest require very little interaction themselves. Mostly just a simple skill check or choice will suffice and lead to the story branching. Whereas, of course, combat is more intricate, but only by a margin, as you play out with cards your tactics until your victim is incapacitated. As such, the sessions play fast and are mostly taking up time engaging with the narrative that come in their own scenario-specific booklets, but it all still manages to feel as light as popcorn. This can be an advantage, as you have more brain power to process the immersion of being in the location and dealing with the scenario specifics, but I would have still liked to have seen a little more complexity, especially for a game that proudly proclaims that you need to keep your bloodlust in check and should not be engaging in combat at all times. Instead, you should be focusing on investigation and dialogue equally so. This pretty much describes the events and world building in the game. The world itself lends heavily from the IP, which is vibrant, rich, and dark, but I still feel that the game relies too heavily on the visuals and the existing world instead of giving new players an actual interactive world to engage with within the story. But there is lots of story, I'll give it that. Most of the weight, and I mean physical weight of the box, comes from dozens of booklets representing character advancements and scenario narratives. This game would have been higher up my list instead of on number 6 if it had just pushed the quality of gameplay content and story interaction as much as that it pushed the pre-delivery presentation of quality and atmosphere of the theme. Despite having 40 scenarios to lovingly engage with, preferably at night with a glass of red wine, the game feels very much like a first attempt of what otherwise could have been a stronger experience. Now, one last note. This was my most anticipated game for literally years, so naturally the bookend experience is hard-pressed to match that level of expectation. I blame myself. I didn't want to punish the game by putting it lower on the list or leaving it off altogether because of this. Even if it didn't completely fulfill its premise, it is at its core precisely the type of game experience that Story Tiles promotes, which is a strong character location event synergetic game experience that is thematically immersive while being mechanically intuitive, and it scores high points on that aspect alone.
Dungeons and exactly one dragon. Congratulations! Humanity's dead. The bad news is that all they left behind is their garbage and a broken gig economy. That's why we need freelancers like you, ready to take any job, no matter how loathsome. As a freelancer, you will delve into ruins, brave the wilds, and slay the hordes of hideous creatures that litter the dark, forgotten corners of the world. All so you can gather loot, return home, and ready to blow it all and start over again the next day. Hey, it's a lousy gig, so it's perfect for the likes of you.
Freelancers was the big surprise of the year. I've always loved the setup of Plaid games. They always ace the relationship between story, characters, and locations, crafting relevant interactions between the three. I heard that Freelancers was kind of an iteration on one of the previous games called Forgotten Waters, but when I saw the game, what I thought stood out was the artwork, which I thought is this sort of post-apocalyptic, gonzo, weird fantasy vibe. Yeah, I really dug that, and that was something that was very different than your typical trope genres. You play this combination of race and job description, your freelancing gig title, by combining two sheets into one character sheet, which I think is awesome. I love, love, love when you can write on things in games, checking off accomplishments, writing personal names and descriptors. I love making something your own by adding notes and scribbles on it, because it speaks to the uniqueness of the experience, something that I already strive for when I play any game. So I love the character sheets, and I love that these characters are really, really wacky. The races are kind of standard fantasy, but the titles can be things like Dung Farmer or Divorcee. Then you have like a little Mad Lib word matching activity with your background, which is always fun, and stats that you level up in as you're playing the adventure. So, what is the adventure actually about? Well, the story is really where this game shines. You go to the Freelancer web app. Now note, not an app that you have to download, it's just a website. That's where all the stories are conveniently hidden, so you won't need a storybook. Plus, you get full audio narration. The dialogue and performances are incredibly funny and charming. It's just wacky fun. Finding yourself in odd situations narrated by professional actors who nail the NPCs you're encountering, as well as those in your own party, is a real treat. That's where all the fun resides. It's a combination of that pre-written narrative with you sinking into your character and starting to roleplay them, or doing silly voices yourself while interacting with other players around the table. That's what truly makes this game. That also brings me to a point that is less enjoyable. When you're a solo player, it's not ideal, because a lot of situations come down to your relationship with other players, where you are on the influence track, and who is reading what's to whom, and which character specifically is being addressed by the story. So while solo is still fun and very much doable, most of the real fun will come from interacting with others. Now, it is still odd to me that you have this glossy bound map book that contains no maps. Instead, it shows an image per location with worker placement style spots where you can place your standee to take an action. There's a timer that forces you to just glance at the actions without thinking too much about them, and then when the timer ends, you go into the actual descriptions, potential skill checks, and the outcome. Because there is no map in this respect to move your standee around on, it really is just a placeholder for your character. There is a paper pad with 5 different maps on it that show your journey, but you don't actually get to play on it. You just cross them off, the locations on it that is, and you make notes on them during play. This is a fun way of going around the landscape as a group, but it still is not exactly the same as moving around on a map. There are enough branching choices to make replaying the game 1 or 2 more times per map, so you'll likely get about 10 and 15 plays out of this game. So the interaction between characters, locations, and events is there, but it's mostly within the app, which will indicate who is being targeted at what location, or depending on where you are on the influence track. The scenarios are fairly straightforward, fairly linear, but that's not really a problem to me. The game is just too much fun to be bothered by something like that, and the mechanics are simple enough that they don't prevent you from immersing yourself in the world. The only drawback that I would find with this game is that, as stated, it is not best at being a solo game. Also, it is a standalone single session kind of a game where you level up fast, and then when the next time you play another adventure, you just start all over again. There's no campaign. Finally, I suspect that there is a limited replayability. Once you've gone through all 5 adventures, you've kind of gotten 60 to 75% of all unique game content played, at which point you're really just looking for choices not made the first time around or places not visited on the map. But for what it is, it's still a very delicious romp of an exploration story game.
Welcome to Isofar, a wild land severe in its beauty. As a member of the Isofarian Guard, life is never dull, and old patterns are shifting. New forces are at work that will challenge the very underpinnings of reality. You will guide 8 different Isofarian Guard throughout 5 interweaving campaigns as they deal with the power that threatens not only Isofar, but the entire world.
The Isofarian Guard is an overland journey adventure game where you play 1 or 2 Isofarian Guards in a solo or 2-player capacity. You play through a campaign that is heavily battle-driven, as well as a harvesting and crafting game. The mechanisms you use for this are grounded in bag building and the collection of cards that represent many of the harvesting materials, gear, items, and skills that you'll need over time. Now, I recall when 3 Kickstarter campaigns ran around the same time many years ago. It was Oathsworn, Ain Trespass, Odyssey, and the Isofarian Guard. At the time, I was immediately attracted to Aeon Trespass Odyssey because it was a new way of experiencing what Kingdom Death Monster did, but as an epic ancient Greek odyssey. Oathsworn spoke to me instantly with its dark and gritty dualistic gameplay of audio-narrated adventuring on one side and boss battling on the other. The Isofarian Guard was, in comparison, this very clean-looking, large and clunky component, trope-looking overland adventure game that didn't immediately appeal to me, mostly because overland journey games like Of Dreams and Shadows and Runebound had disappointed me in the past, and so I wasn't exactly sure whether to back this or not. And in the end I did, and these 3 games went through development hell for the next few years until ATO and Oathsworn finally delivered last year, and the Isofarian Guard delivered early this year. The characters are the Isofarian Guards of the game's title, who are tasked with keeping the peace and dealing with constant threats from an aggressive nemesis. They are represented by these huge player boards upon which you lay cards and manipulate cubes, alongside an oversized miniature that you move around the map that holds 1 or 2 characters. With 4 campaign books that introduce a new set of guards each time, you are spoiled with variety and fresh characters to discover. If I had one complaint, it would be that the lack of racial and cultural diversity is fairly apparent. They're basically 5 male and 3 female ranger types, all of whom are white. I have not played all duos, but I know that the first duo is a fighter and a potion maker, so maybe that's where the specific traits feel fresh. You wander across the land of Isofar, which is represented by a large board or neoprene mat. What you do between going from location to location, wherever the overall story directs you, is resolving encounters and harvest materials for crafting later on. After fighting and gaining Lux, which is the XP of the game, you level up according to your tech tree and building up your camp. The crafting of camp and gear is fun, but you will need to know the land, quote-unquote, in order to get the right materials. Settlements also have a distinctive flavor, as you get special items in certain places, and a handy guide references all of this. There are many types of quests to pursue: main story quests, side quests, caravan quests, and bounty quests. So even though 70 to 80% of the game is moving from node to node and resolving combat, harvesting, or having the occasional event, the grind is manageable. Since its release, Sky Kingdom Games has already come out with the promise of a second edition where the grinding issues would be manageable, but they're also very easy to homebrew yourself. There are some production issues, despite the game's effort to make it a deluxe experience. The chips you use for in the bags are big and heavy and don't lend themselves well to being used directly on the map as markers, and you're kinda supposed to. The boards take up a ginormous amount of table space, what with how the layout and the choice of card sizes is handled on top of them. This by far is the heaviest game I own, and it takes actual effort to lift the box up. Even though the setup and teardown is made easy peasy for you with the way that the trays are managed and slide into and out of the box, I would not like to take this game with me to game night, for instance. Now, the reason why this game is on the top 10 is because the journey of playing this game, including setup and breakdown, is so smooth and effortless. I won't need to reread the rulebook much. The art and graphic design of the components is pleasant and instantly immersive, while managing to meld characters, locations, and events effortlessly. The audio narration is probably the highlight of the entire game and adds greatly to this immersion. And if you're willing to homebrew, which I always am, then the grind is very manageable and you're not always spending time fighting or harvesting. All in all, I think that this game ranks above already highly regarded adventure games like Chronicles of Drunagor and Descent, 2nd Edition, and Legends, but still slightly under the much edgier and textured Tainted Grail, Oathsworn, and Aeon Trespass Odyssey. There are actually 2 more games that came out this year that rank higher than the Isofarian Guard, or equal, if not larger scale and scope of experience.
Four young mercenaries will find their feet during the war between Rome and Venice. They are ready to make their way in the Italian Renaissance, shattered by war and by mysterious myths that emerge from a distant past. Each of these heroes will have a role on the battlefield and will be able to evolve by acquiring new classes, skills, and equipment.
If that description of Nova Ada's Renaissance is quite generic, then it isn't disservice to this game, especially if you're familiar with Black Rose Wars and in my case, Dungeonology. You will already have stepped into this world of a fantasy Italian Renaissance. Black Rose Wars feels like an overproduced experience for a straight-up PvP spell dueling game, while Dungeonology feels like a drawn-out game of Take That, where younger versions of this game's heroes seek to graduate from university by researching monsters instead of defeating them, and both are poorly designed. Not so with Nova Ada's Renaissance. You will get the best balance between theme and mechanics struck yet. A meld between dungeon crawler and tactical miniatures game with a juicy campaign of branching scenarios chock full of new content waiting to be discovered, point of interest moments, and choose your own adventure elements. This is the very definition of an adventure game. All that is lacking is an audio narration at this point. After all, it seems to have been the year of audio narration for most adventure games, it seems, and this one does not have that. But don't let that fool you. The four main characters are Vincenzo, Valerio, Rebecca, and Sofia, with more provided by extension packs and stretch goals like Altair from Assassin's Creed, the Medicio inspired by The Mandalorian, and characters like Agorex, Gregorio, Brynhildr, Luca, and Fatima, crossover characters from a variety of other games that I'm not quite familiar with. But all of them are wildly asymmetric, and come complete with their own discovery deck of cards, a skill sheet in 3 different levels, and a character sheet that goes into this novel cardboard cover that holds the cubes for the attributes, skills, hit points, and experience points. All of these RPG elements are being tracked on this player board. Locations are very reminiscent of a dungeon crawler, if not for the fact that you're not surrounded by walls on all sides or in the form of dungeon tiles and hallways that you lay down on the table, but rather these big tiles of grassland and city cobblestones with 3D terrain and buildings on them, including a tower and ladders and whatnot. This all gives it a table presence of a skirmish game, while retaining a distinct dungeon crawler feel because you're always on a mission. There are enemies that form obstacles, traps to be overcome, and skill checks to be made in order to progress to the end of each scenario. The fact that I am mixing characters, locations, and events now already as I'm describing the game goes to show how well merged that these 3 aspects really are, and it is a delight to continuously discover new things within the story. There are new skills to be used, new gear to be crafted, new loot to be gathered and sold, and new personal discoveries to be uncovered. Now, the rules of the game are the best that I have yet seen from Ludus Magnus Studios. That may not be saying much, given their checkered past of having poorly written rulebooks and unclear rules in general, but it still is an improvement over their past methodology of trying to add everything, including the kitchen sink, into their games. And as a hobby gamer and role player, I find a great delight in playing fast and loose with the rules or just filling them in where necessary. But that's barely necessary here because these rules are tight, and not to mention easy to remember between sessions. What really stands out though, and this is why it's number 3 on my list, is the absolutely stylish table presence that begins with the 3D elements, sure, and the miniatures, which are dynamic as usual, but then continues into every single card. So let's discuss the minis first. The sculpts are among the best of any game that has miniatures on the market, rivaling, in my opinion, CMON and Games Workshop. The visual style on the cards, then, is astoundingly detailed, as if like in sync with these miniatures. They're highly engrossing and just a pleasure to examine. Every card has a front and back that is meticulously and often with great variety designed and drawn. The artwork is charming and reminiscent of the Italian Renaissance with a surprising factor of fantasy elements. And so the table presence as a whole warrants playing this game. But if you're also on top of that a fan of true exploration and discovery in your adventure games, then this one will hold your attention for a very long time.
History is full of secrets. The desert is quivering at a rumor. Echoes of ancient prophecies are filling forgotten temples. Inexplicable events are multiplying. A team of archaeologists and adventurers stumble upon a mystery that history forgot as they explore an ancient Egyptian tomb. To uncover the truth,
They will have to delve deeper and deeper into the pyramids, dodging deadly traps and fighting back swaths of monsters. Has the old pharaoh placed a curse on this expedition? Should some secrets remain untold?
Archaes is a cooperative story-driven campaign game set among ancient 3D Egyptian ruins that pretty much flew under the radar for most gamers and reviewers in 2023. Cursed by the post-COVID delays of many Kickstarter games, the French-based Ankama, with a crack team of designers Antoine Bauza, Corentin Lebras, Ludovic Maublanc, and Theo Riviere, set forth to do a dungeon crawler that would reinvigorate the genre while keeping it accessible to new audiences. If it wasn't for Vampire the Masquerade chapters and freelancers, this would easily be the least complex entry on this year's list. What it lacks in gameplay crunchiness, however, it makes up in spades in rich theme, content discovery, and easy to get to the table adventuring. Our intrepid adventurers are from all walks of life. You have a perky teacher with loads of energy, a resourceful mechanic with a mechanical arm, a desert ranger who keeps the greedy foreigners in check, and a tough but charming brawler from America. These are the characters that you play with. There are extra characters who lean heavier on the Indiana Jones side, but they're all vivid archetypes given form by artists Alejandro Munoz Aviles, Jeffrey Beyer, Hugo Gomez Briones, and many others. Because the game is elegantly streamlined, the characters only differ in the one skill that they bring to each venture, but of course over time, as this is a campaign in roughly 10 scenarios, they will personalize further with objects that they can obtain. The enemies are wonderful melds of Egyptian lore and steampunk, and there are quite a few of them too, each type with their own randomized set of AI cards to operate them. Again, nothing too complex, but always unexpected. Ankama always produces crisp miniatures with fun poses, and I love them because they're a joy to paint, and Archaes has a lovely, lovely set of unique models in that respect. Delving into an Egyptian tomb was never more cinematic than with Archaes. With its 3D modular rooms and double-sided scenery tiles, it is pure excitement to open up new rooms behind doors of your current one. Maybe there's treasure, maybe enemies, or maybe just a clue as to how to get out of a death trap of a temple filling itself with sand. Whenever rooms are added, one or more search tokens pop up that add more points of interest to examine. Everything about this game is about examination and discovery. You have a campsite that gives you special perks in between every adventure, and then there's the missions. This game is one of the new type of shorter campaigns that gamers seem to crave nowadays. For me, it doesn't really matter, as each session needs to offer just variety and specific elements, and campaigns in general tend to do this whether they are short or long. The stuff that you can find with each mission comes in these little thematic crate boxes. First, there are extra decks that have narrative elements and events on them, or treasure that can be found. And then, of course, each mission has a fresh tomb layout, with perhaps new enemies to overcome, new traps to avoid, and obstacles to overcome as well. Archaes is most definitely a legacy game, as you permanently write your progress down in a logbook and stick stickers of new and helpful tents in your camp. This is legacy done right, in my opinion. Give me a more memorable campaign that feels like I've lived through the Mummy or Indiana Jones franchises. The campaign may be 70% on rails, in that every gamer group will more or less visit the same locations and encounter similar events, but the experience will still be unique and distinctive. I have nothing but good things to say about Archaes. It is one of those adventure games that is elegant in design, easy to get into and drop in and out of. It has luscious art and graphic design, beautiful sculpts, and together makes for one of the most successful and effortlessly immersive experiences that I have played this year. Many games that try for easy entries or smaller campaigns, or even just one-off session models of gameplays, tend to be way too simple. I could see people saying that about Vampire the Masquerade, for instance. Other games try a little too hard to meld narrative thematic elements with hardcore gameplay like Oathsworn or Kinfire Chronicles, which then end up feeling like a split experience. There's not enough flow between story and strategy in those cases, but Anton and friends have nailed it here. This is a solid number 2. And why not 1? Well, let's find out.
There is something besides and beyond the Empire, with dozens of ships on the horizon full of dark elves who cross the seas from a distant continent. The Kemet invasion has begun. What does this unknown civilization want? Why are some Tenarians suddenly in favor of them? Could this trigger another Malrokian curse? As players wonder about these questions, they won't be able to simply charge at the overwhelming forces this time.
Arena the contest funded in April 2018. Upon delivery, a year later, they announced a new project, an expansion which would launch in February 2020, and would be a massive story campaign which would come with over 100 quests, hundreds of pages in its books, and guess what? Hundreds of hours of gameplay. That expansion was called Tenaris Adventures, and it is one of the last big crowdfunding projects that would list endless stretch goals and goodies, which would also cause, of course, much delay before finally delivering 3 years later in February this year. Leading up to this point in time, I was super jaded about the entire experience. After all, not only were we constantly bombarded by long involved updates with tons of lore and gameplay highlights that made no sense to me, having not set foot in the world of Tenaris yet after all, a mere 8 months after finishing the campaign, Dragori already announced their follow-up, the RPG to Tenaris Adventures. This meant even more things to pledge towards and read about of a game backers knew nothing about unless they owned Arena. Even when Tenaris Adventures finally arrived, backers who didn't own Arena still had to wait an additional 4 months before that arrived, and it was necessary to play Tenaris after all, more or less. So how did this broken up delivery, massively bloated game end up being my Game of the Year 2023? Tenaris is single-handedly the biggest world you can play in these days, with dozens of heroes facing off against 100 plus unique villains, commanders, or heroes turned into villains, companions and bosses, many of which represented by truly intimidating miniatures. There is enough to play instant death mode, where each time a character is defeated, you simply grab the next and retire the old one. Or play 2 teams of 4 heroes which go off in their separate adventures and rejoin for the epic showdown at the end. There are crossover characters with at least a dozen other games, so there's narrative overlap if you choose to continue their stories in those games that they originate from. For instance, Nyx from Madara is now counting her 6th crossover so far. Characters are divvied up into several archetypes and classes, each of which play a specific role that they assume within their group's adventures. Speaking of, the teamwork and cooperation in the game is really tight. The character-tailored action cards each hero gets are nothing new, we've seen that in Gloomhaven, but the skill sets, they allow heroes to contribute in small but effective ways when it's not their turn and someone else is playing. And that's simply brilliant. There's never downtime. Each character has a background, in fact everything has a background, which designers Alexandra Abo, Danilo de Alcantara, Michael Alves, and Clayton Mercado have presented both online and in print in copious amounts. Now, and this goes for everything in the world of Tenaris. There is a world map that indicates how widespread your travels are going to be. In fact, you will be traveling a lot and playing out encounters on the arena board or one of the 7 alternative layouts, and it's simply amazing how varied each mission is and how they manage to convey that using the same rectangular dungeon board over and over again. 3D walls, obstacles, and random bits and pieces give character to each location without the need for dozens of separate dungeon tiles. Mind you, the boxes are already stuffed to the brim with miniatures, cards, books, and tokens, so it's probably a good thing that they managed to craft over 100 quests on this one board. I did not have that board at first because it was part of Arena, the contest, so I concocted my own board and walls in order to play Tenaris, and it was still awesome. And this speaks to the incredible smart design of this experience. The campaign runs in cycles, each with its 3 phases, a city phase, a journey phase, and a quest phase, and all your decisions matter and significantly impact the quest's gameplay in a multi-branching storyline, which is something they actually pull off, rather than just use it as a group of marketing buzzwords. The books that come with the first edition were for me a delight to switch back and forth from, although many people did not agree with that. It felt like this meta quest of researching ancient tomes to follow the story. Dragori has since opted for an everything regarding this mission in one book concept, and also they are rewriting the narrative and adding foreteller audio to it, which is both a blessing and a curse. I kinda liked the undecorated prose where the story bit simply told me what was going on. That kind of felt like the old 1980s novels for like Dragonlance and Forgotten Realms, that kind of style of writing, and that you read the facts and then fill in the blanks with your own imagination. Still, all is good even with the second edition, as there is just so much story to dive into and so much open world wandering you can choose to pursue. There is both room for pre-written narrative as well as emergent one. Tenaris Adventures is a hobbyist game ultimate dream. A huge toolkit of adventuring fun that comes with some assembly, but also with a treasure trove of world building and an actual campaign to play right out of the box. 2, with the upcoming retrofitted Arena, the contest campaign. This is a lifestyle game in every sense of the word. It will take you a lifetime to play through it and then build upon with the RPG delivering soon. So what makes this so different than, for instance, Dungeon Universalis, or League of Dungeoneers, Dungeon Crusade, or other toolboxes of games? Well, first off, those are OSR-styled games. OSR stands for Old School Renaissance or Revival, meaning that they hearken to the old days of outfitting your character with gear and generate a grey stone dungeon with randomized trope monsters, traps, and events. None of those come close to the structured campaigning and singular, heroic fantasy style and vibe that this world has been dressed up in. Tenaris feels like the best work of TSR's Dragonlance from the 80s, for instance, in that it shook the foundations of classic fantasy and introduced colorful new races, heroes, and villains, set in this magical world that felt vibrant and relatable. There was drama and personal stakes amidst a seemingly undefeatable threat. So as this top 10 shows, not all game experiences have to be epically large in scope, or content, or rich in texture, in theme, and gameplay. But for a game enthusiast as myself, having the best in both worlds of crunchy tactical sessions combined with settlement building, overland adventuring, a massive yet accessible overall plot, and backup lore in RPG books to tap into and read up on is truly one of a kind magnificent. Last year, my number one game was Trudvang Legends, which follows a similar wholesome approach to gaming if you happen to own the Chronicles and Adventures RPG books. Sadly, the expansions of Simon still have to deliver their remaining content, and even Chronicles of Drunagor in 2021 was ace, although Tenaris at the moment outshines both of them. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed this rundown of 15 excellent adventures to go on. I admit some of these games are hard to get your hands on, while others are readily accessible, so find your own level of immersion and gameplay complexity. But above all, remember, keep on exploring in 2024.